The Killer of Jalahalli by Kenneth Anderson. This is not the story of a man-eating tiger, nor even of a man-eating panther, but of an ordinary leopard of very average size, who fought bravely in defense of its own life, fought cleverly and effectively, killing 3 people and mauling 11 others in the process, dying gamely at last, undefeated and after days of suffering. In 1938, prior to the outbreak of World War II, the village of Jalahalli, situated barely 7 miles northwest of Bangalore, near the road to Tumkur, was an unimportant hamlet, perhaps boasting of 150 houses, some of which were made of brick and others of thatch. As the city of Bangalore is the headquarters of the government of Mysore, the forest department of that state, which is rich in forests of both evergreen and monsoon varieties, had its headquarters in Bangalore. The systematic loss and destruction of various forms of natural forest woods by insect and other pests was then engaging the close attention of the government, and a plantation of forest seedlings had been set within a mile of Jalahalli, covering about 4 square miles of land, in which sandalwood, rosewood, red rosewood, and other trees had been grown in natural array, in order to study the action of the various insect pests in close reach of the laboratories at Bangalore. These plants had grown to an average height of about 10 feet, while the usual undergrowth of spear grass, lantana, and occasional wait-a-bit thorn thickly carpeted the ground to form dense thickets that had become the home of innumerable snakes, quite a number of rabbits, an occasional peafowl, and of course partridge and quail in considerable quantity. Into this area one day strayed a wandering leopard from the rocky hills of Magadhi, 20 miles away. It began its sojourn by living on the rabbits, rats, and other small animals of the forest plantation, but soon learned that it had a ready larder in the nearby hamlet of Jalahalli in the form of goats and village dogs, which it began to eat with irksome regularity. All went well till one day the leopard destroyed a goat belonging to the fat police dafedar or sergeant of Jalahalli. This act the official held to be an affront to his dignity and rank, and he swore to avenge it with the death of the leopard. The native police force had been armed with service .303 rifles, from which the magazines were removed so that only 1 round could be fired at a time. This had been done as a precautionary measure against over-enthusiastic policemen firing round after round into mobs during local riots, which are sometimes common at relatively slight provocation. And so the dafedar sat up in a tree over his dead goat, armed with a single-shot service .303 rifle. Along came the panther at sundown, quite unsuspectingly, to receive a wound in its left foreleg, for the dafedar's aim had been unaccountably unsteady due to equally unaccountably shaky hands. The panther bounded away with a grunt. The fat dafedar shivered through the night in his tree, descended next morning, examined the ground for blood, but found none, and concluded that he had very fortunately missed the leopard. Anyhow, he figured that it had been taught a lesson and would leave his goats severally alone in the future. This happened on a Friday night. The next day, Saturday, passed uneventfully, and that evening the villagers decided on conducting a large-scale rabbit beat the following morning. Yards and yards of 2-foot-high rabbit net were laid along the edge of the forest department plantation and around some 3 acres of casuarina trees that adjoined it. The beat next morning was to be conducted by about 100 villagers, accompanied by dogs and armed with short wooden clubs. The rabbits would run into the nets and while struggling to get free would be clubbed to death. All went according to plan, till the casuarina clump was reached, where, to the surprise and horror of all nearby, out jumped a leopard instead of a harmless rabbit. It rushed the ring of beaters in the near vicinity, and in less time than it takes to write, had mauled 6 of them in various degrees of intensity, from a scratch or two to a regular bite, or a deep raking from its razor-sharp claws. The beaters scattered in every direction, and the panther returned to the casuarinas. Nearby lived Huey Plunkett and his mother. He had been a hunter of considerable repute in his days, having shot around a dozen tigers and perhaps twice that number of panthers in the forest areas of Diguvameta in the Kurnool district of the Madras Presidency. The dispersed beaters approached him with news of the leopard and appealed for help. Huey had been spending a late morning in bed and was in his pajamas. He had not heard about the incident of the police dafedars wounding the leopard, and scarcely credited the possibility of such an animal having strayed to within 7 miles of the city of Bangalore. Anyhow, to appease the worrying villagers, he slipped an LG and a ball cartridge into the respective barrels of his .12 bore shotgun and accompanied them to the casuarina belt. Here he saw the mauled beaters and realized for the first time that a panther was actually in the vicinity. A careful stalk through the casuarinas commenced, a small crowd of about 6 men following in a knot at his rear. Huey had passed more than halfway through the trees when the panther made the mistake of showing itself by darting from one patch of cover to the other. A quick left and right from Huey bowled him over, and the animal lay twitching on its side. Huey dashed up, trailed by his followers, and then made the mistake which cost him his life. He touched the now still form with his foot. The animal came to life, galvanized into action. It sprang upon Plunkett, fastened its fangs into his upper right arm, so that he could not use his weapon, while its hind claws raked him into streaming red ribbons. The men around him scattered, only one of them attempting to beat off the animal with his ridiculous rabbit club. The panther then left Huey and sprang upon this man, whom, together with 4 others, it clawed and bit before rushing back to the sheltering casuarinas, leaving its own blood trail behind. The scene of carnage can well be imagined, with Plunkett at its center. It took quite 60 minutes for the men to pull themselves together and carry Huey, who had fainted and whose right arm hung on by a mere strip of sinew, back to his farmhouse. He bled profusely during the journey, and I wondered, when following the trail 2 days later, how could a human being lose so much blood and still live? Mrs. Plunkett, with commendable presence of mind, bundled him into their car, together with 4 of the more severely wounded men, and headed for the Bowring Hospital in Bangalore. The remaining 7 mauled villagers were taken to the Victoria Hospital, also at Bangalore. Blood transfusion was given to Huey, and an effort was made to save his arm. But when gangrenous symptoms set in the following day, it was amputated. The shock and loss of blood proved too great for him, and he died the next day in a delirium of fever. All this had happened on a Sunday morning. That same afternoon, a wandering goat-herd observed the blood trail of the leopard as it entered the outskirts of the Forest Department plantation, having left the casuarina trees, and informed 2 brothers living in the village of Jalahalli named Kalayya and Papaya, respectively. Next morning, which was Monday, these 2 brothers very pluckily, albeit foolishly, determined to follow up the leopard on their own. The elder brother, Kalayya, owned a hammer, .12 bore of old design. The younger brother, Papaya, had a single-barreled muzzle-loader. Loading up, these 2 brave men, shoulder to shoulder, followed the blood spoor into the undergrowth of the plantation. Wandering along like this, they became separated, and in a twinkling, the leopard pounced upon Kalayya, throwing him to the ground and biting through bladder and testicles with savage ferocity. The force of the pounds had knocked the 12-bore from his hands, and as he lay screaming with the animal on top of him, his younger brother rushed to the rescue, discharging his muzzle loader into the panther as it lay on top of Kalaya. How he did not also shoot his brother remains a mystery. The leopard, now still further wounded, left Kalaya and pounced on Papaya, who fell on his face, the fangs tearing through his back into his lung, while the talons of the hind feet raked the unfortunate man's buttocks and the backs of his thighs, and the animal then made off. I was eating lunch that day when a man appeared at my door in a lather of sweat to give me the news. Hastily, I grabbed my rifle, shotgun and torch and jumped into the car, my wife, not to be outdone at the last moment, determining to come with me. As I turned out of the gate of our bungalow onto the main road, I met Eric Newcombe of the local police force, who was on his way to visit me. Telling him what had happened and making my apologies, I endeavored to get away, but Eric refused to be excluded from the party and piled into the car also. It did not take us long to reach Jalahalli, and the sight that met our eyes there was ludicrous in the extreme. Every inhabitant, from the youngest to the oldest, had come out. A vast concourse had approached the edge of the plantation in order to catch a glimpse of the leopard, if possible. These had all taken to the branches of trees for personal safety, until the trees in the vicinity literally bent almost to the breaking point with the load of humanity they carried. But nobody had gone forward to rescue Kalaya and Papaya, who still lay in the plantation where they had fallen 4 hours earlier, feebly shouting for help. The first thing was obviously to succor these men, so we recruited a dozen carriers and entered the bush. We found Kalaya in a very bad condition and in extreme agony. Bubbles of blood were oozing from Papaya's punctured lung. We conveyed them both to the car, and I had started the engine to carry them to the hospital when a villager dashed up with quite the longest spear I had ever seen in my life. Of what practical use it is impossible to say, being upwards of 12 feet in length. And with the news that he had just seen the panther slink into a big bush 300 yards away, where we could easily shoot it if we would only go with him. I am aware that what happened hereafter was my own fault, in that I failed in my duty of first conveying the injured men to hospital. I plead, however, that the excitement of the situation and the temptation of this easy opportunity to bag the panther overcame my better judgment and caused me to go after the animal. Eric Newcombe insisted in accompanying me, so I handed him my 12-bore shotgun, loaded with LG in the left barrel and a lethal cartridge in the right, together with a few spare shells, while I retained the .405 rifle for my own use. This again was another mistake, as future events proved. I should have armed myself with the shotgun instead. We were accompanied only by the individual with the exaggerated spear, the remainder of our party having melted away. My wife brought up the rear as a spectator at a distance. We approached to within 25 yards of the big patch of scrub, not one particular bush as had been stated by the spearmen, into which the panther was seen to have crawled, and I told Eric to move over about 30 yards to my right so as to avoid each other's line of fire, while completely covering the animal's every possible escape from the vicinity. I then instructed the spear holder to stone the scrub, which he did very thoroughly for about 20 minutes. However, we heard and saw nothing. I confess that I then became very doubtful whether the panther was in the neighborhood at all. A little later, Eric called out that he could see right into the scrub and that the panther was not there. By this time, some bolder spirits from the crowd had joined us. One of them was accompanied by a dog, which we tried to induce to enter the scrub in the hope that its sense of smell would locate the leopard. But the dog refused to have anything to do with this proposition and remained on the outskirts, barking at the undergrowth. This made me revise my opinion with regard to the panther being absent. Eric had by this time, however, become impatient and approached to within a few yards of the scrub, which he then commenced to stone on his own account. Nothing happened when his first few stones fell. Then he threw a large one, which evidently landed directly on or very near the panther. There was a loud "aw, aw," and like a streak of yellow light, the beast shot from out of the scrub. He had no time to raise the shotgun, but nervous reaction evidently compelled him to press his trigger finger, and thus probably saved his life. The gun went off, blowing a hole in the ground before him, and undoubtedly scaring the panther considerably. The next second it landed upon him, sweeping the gun out of his grasp, while Eric and panther in close embrace rolled down a short steep bank of cud and into the long spear grass that clothed a small adjacent nala. All this time Eric was shouting to me to shoot, and the leopard growled horribly. I could only see the violent agitation of the spear grass. I rushed forward, afraid of risking a shot from my heavy rifle at such close quarters, which would pierce both the leopard and Eric, tangled up as they were together. Then the panther left Newcombe and sprang into the lantana bordering the cut. I fired, and as subsequent events proved, scored but a furrowing wound along the top of the beast's neck. I expected Eric to lie prone after that encounter, but was gratified to see him spring to his feet and race in the opposite direction at really marathon speed. I have often chided him on his running abilities since that day, and it is with him a very sore point. He had been bitten right through his side, one of the ribs being cracked by a fang, while his thighs and arms were badly lacerated by the sharp and powerful claws. We called it a day, then, and went to the Bowring Hospital, the seats of the car being soaked with human blood by the time we got the 3 wounded men there. The rest of that evening was spent in writing statements for the police and in answering innumerable questions, some of which were inane. Poor Kalaya died that night in extreme pain. His brother, Papaya, recovered after a month, having narrowly missed succumbing to the injury to his lung. Eric Newcombe, due to the intervention of Providence and a good constitution, did not run even the slightest temperature and made a complete recovery in a fortnight. The next day, Tuesday, saw several hunters after the wounded animal. There was Lloydsworth of the tobacco factory, a famed shikari who had shot many tigers and panthers, and Beck, an equally renowned shot and big game hunter. Never a trace could be found, however. All blood trail had petered out, and the panther had vanished, seemingly into thin air. That evening, it killed a herds boy, aged about 12 years, who had ventured too near the spot where, unknown to him, the beast was lying. Incidentally, this spot was over a mile from the locality where the earlier incidents had taken place. The boy was killed outright. The panther had seized his throat and bitten through the jugular and windpipe. The morning of the 5th day, Wednesday, found me at the spot where the herds boy had been killed. We made every endeavor to follow the wounded animal which, although very severely hit, had ceased bleeding by this time due to the congealing of the blood, at least externally. I floundered about in the dense grass and lantana, which grew thicker as the ground sloped into a hollow. Halfway down this slope, the leopard heard or saw me coming and began to growl its warning against further approach. This was fortunate, for otherwise I might not be here to tell you this story. The undergrowth being almost impenetrable, I called a halt to further advance, which would have been suicidal, and decided to await events, which I was almost certain would end in a day or two with the death of the panther from its many major wounds. Later that day occurred an amusing incident. The police had turned out in force from Bangalore. Some 30 of them, armed with single-shot service rifles, had been crowded into a police van, which was protected all around by expanded metal meshing against stoning by mobs during times of riot. The driver of this improvised armored car had been instructed to scour the plantation till the enemy was located and brought to book by the riflemen. This he proceeded to do to the best of his ability, but not knowing where he was going in the long speared grass and tangled undergrowth, he eventually succeeded in half-capsizing the vehicle in a concealed overgrown ditch. The driver and men were imprisoned inside and shouted lustily for help. None of them would venture out, for was there not a man-killing leopard loose that would kill and eat the first to alight? Hearing cries at a distance, we approached the spot and released the imprisoned representatives of the law, who then managed to set their vehicle back on its wheels and returned to their barracks hardly any the worse for their adventure. Before leaving, they stated they had heard growls in the undergrowth, but this I put down to a bad attack of mass nerves. I had made it a point to be at the plantation daily from 7 a.m. till sunset, and at about noon on the 6th day, which was Thursday, I saw vultures gathering in the sky. Watching them through my binoculars, I saw them alight in the midst of the small valley that divided the plantation, the same one, in fact, as that into which I had tried to force my way the previous day. I knew these sagacious birds had found something dead. It was either the panther itself or something that had been killed by the panther. Cautiously, I forced myself through the dense lantana and clinging wait-a-bit thorn, expecting any moment to hear the guttural coughs of the leopard as it charged me. Nothing happened, however, and at last, lacerated by the thorns, I reached the valley. I had gone about 50 yards when 4 vultures rose from the ground with a heavy flapping of wings. Advancing, I came on a small pool of water with the panther lying dead beside it in the act of drinking. The unfortunate animal had bled internally a great deal and suffered the pangs of thirst and fever. The exertion of crawling to water and drinking must have increased the bleeding, for it had vomited a great gout of thick blood into the water before dying, and this stained the pool a clouded crimson. The vultures had just settled upon my arrival, and fortunately had had no time to destroy the skin. Going back to Jalahalli, I soon found the men to carry the dead animal to my car lashed to a pole. I took it to Yashwantapur police station to make an official report. Here, I was delayed for 3 hours while awaiting the arrival of the necessary officials, much to my annoyance, as I feared the skin might spoil from not being removed from the carcass. At last, I was given permission to take away the dead animal, which you may be sure I lost no time in doing. While skinning, I had ample opportunity to piece together the sequence of facts that had resulted in the death of 3 persons and the several maulings. The wound in the leopard's left foreleg, which had been inflicted by the .303 bullet of the fat police dafedar, was crawling with worms and completely gangrenous. Huey Plunkett's shotgun ball had passed completely through the animal, cutting through the stomach without inflicting an immediately fatal wound. A single LG pellet from the other barrel was embedded in the bone of the forehead and had evidently stunned the animal completely, allowing Plunkett to walk up and touch it. 5 slugs from Papaya's musket were embedded in its side, but all too far back to cause immediate effect. And lastly, my own thoroughly ineffective rifle shot, as the beast bounded away from Eric Newcombe, had scored but a deep furrow across the back of the animal's neck. I produced this skin at the court, in support of a claim for government assistance by Kalaiya's family for the loss of their breadwinner and the gift of a plot of land for their sustenance. I am glad to record that in the course of time the dead man's daring was recognized. With the advent of World War II, Jalahalli underwent a radical change. The Forest Department plantation and the casuarina trees were cut down, and thousands of buildings appeared, first to house Italian prisoners of war, and then as one of the largest hospital bases for the projected invasion of Burma and Malaya, and latterly to house Air Force personnel, being one of the main training bases in India for her rapidly expanding air arm. The skin of this panther now adorns the hall of my bungalow. I cannot help but record the deep admiration and respect in which I hold this beast. For while others killed in stealth, taking their victims unawares, this leopard fought cleanly and courageously in defense of its own life, against great odds, though it was severely wounded. The end.